So this is lecture 1 of the nervous system, the introduction to the brain. I'm just going to go through some basic terminology so we can learn how to orientate ourselves when someone is describing a certain part of the anatomy, or when we're reading some literature or a textbook or watching a video. We'll know exactly what the person we're listening to is referring to. So the first, we're going to start with the sagittal plane. The figure on the left here in the red plane, you see it divides the human body from top to bottom. And so when we're looking at a sagittal plane, we'll be looking at the body from a side view. The section where it is cut or sectioned, it will be shown to us in a side view. The coronal section, on the other hand, is when the body is divided top to bottom, but it's through a left to right sort of plane. So when we're looking at it, we'll be looking at the body as if we're looking at it from the front or from the back when that section is made. And finally, we have a transverse plane. So a transverse section is obviously when the body is cut in half and you're looking either down or up on that section. When we come to the human body itself, we have a superior and an inferior aspect. So in this instance, the neck is superior to the leg and the leg is inferior to the neck. Inferior meaning below and superior meaning above. Lateral means away from the midline of the body, and medial means towards the midline of the body. So your arm is lateral to your sternum and your sternum is medial to your arm. When we're talking about front and back, we have posterior or dorsal refers to the back of the person, and anterior or ventral refers to the front or towards the front. Now, when we're talking about the brain itself, as you might realize, and it's well known that the brain is filled with convolutions, that is, ridges and valleys. Now, the ridges of these convolutions are called gyri, or in the singular form, it's a gyrus. The ridge is a gyrus. The valley, on the other hand, is a sulcus, or sulci in plural form. The outer layer of the brain is called the cortex, or often referred to as the cortical layer or cortical matter, whereas the internal matter of the brain is called white matter. Now, when we look at a neuron, it's also divided up into a few parts that we can divide it into. The first is the cell body. Obviously, that contains all the cellular organelles and the DNA and the methods for reproduction, or replication, I should say. And the cell membrane, it has these projections coming out of it, and we refer to these projections as dendrites, and these interact with the environment around them and with other neurons. So the information comes into the cell body through the dendrites when we're talking about a basic neuron. Now, that information, it'll be electrical information or chemical electrical information, and this electrical signal is transferred from the cell body through the axon, which is another projection from the cell membrane of the cell body. And along this axon, you'll notice these white capsules. They represent Schwann cells. It's a type of cell that encapsulates the axon, or this projection, this membrane projection of the cell body, and that's referred to as myelination. The axon is myelinated, or it's insulated from the outside environment by the cell that forms this, like an electrical cable has an outer sheath, that myelinated sheath, myelination. The signal travels from the cell body through this myelinated or insulated axon, and it arrives at the axon terminals, which are all these little branches out here, and at the ends of those axon terminals are what's known as boutons, French for button. So this contains vesicles that contain neurotransmitters that will be released upon innervation or stimulation. So the signal comes in through the cell body, travels down through the axon, and is transferred into a chemical messenger at the boutons and goes on to stimulate other cells. So we come back to the basic, this is what we're talking about before, this is a coronal section of the brain. So we're looking either front or back on the brain, and we have the left of the brain on the left and right of the brain on the right. So when we're talking about neurons, that cell body that we looked at, that's contained in the cortex. That's what gives it that grey colour. We can't really, it's pink in this example, but known as grey matter is the outside layer or outer layers of the brain, and that's grey because it contains the cellular bodies. The white matter, on the other hand, contains those axons that extend to other areas of the brain, and they're white because that myelination that we're talking about, that insulation, that is white, and that's what gives it the white colour. So when we look at the brain as a whole, we're looking at it from a superior angle here, we're looking down on the brain. We have a division in the brain from top to bottom, or from front to back, and this is called the longitudinal fissure. And this divides the brain into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Now the left hemisphere is usually the dominant hemisphere in most people. It's usually the hemisphere that's strongly associated with language. Whereas the right hemisphere is more to do with conceptual ideas and things like creativity and art and music and song, things like that. The lobes of the brain, we're looking at a lateral view of the brain now. It's not a section, so you could say it's a sagittal section, but it's not actually a section, so we're just looking at it from the lateral view, from the side. We have the anterior, or the front of the brain, to the left, and the posterior, or the back of the brain, to the right. So, at the very front we have what's known as the frontal lobe, and just behind that is the parietal lobe. Now on the sides of the brain, as what's lateral to the brain, is what's known as the temporal lobe, and finally at the very end of the brain is the occipital lobe, and underneath that is the cerebellum. So each one of these has a certain amount of function associated with each of them. Now these functions are very generalized, and there's a certain amount of overlap between different areas of the brain, but just for a general idea, the frontal lobe is associated with your judgment and also with your movement. The parietal lobe, on the other hand, is more associated with spatial awareness and also sensory analysis and processing. The temporal lobe, it's involved in audition or auditory processing and analysis. It's also known for mood and for memory. The occipital lobe is totally associated with vision. And the cerebellum, this what they call the little brain, is associated with automatic movements that you might make, like walking or playing the piano, or learned movements that require feedback and integration with other areas of the brain. This is done with at the cerebellum. Now, talking about these lobes, we can have a basic idea where these lobes are. Like some areas of the brain, we don't really have a very specific area that we can point to and say this is exactly what it is. But the lobes of the brain, however, are divided pretty definitively. When we come to the brain, we have a valley, remember, a sulcus, that extends from the center, or down the center of the brain, pretty much to another valley or sulcus that we'll get to in a second. So this central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So you can see that in front of the central sulcus we have the frontal lobe, and posterior to the central sulcus we have the parietal lobe. Now the lateral fissure, this is the division that runs up the brain, or that divides the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes. And finally we have the parietal occipital sulcus. It's not really seen in the lateral view, but if you look from an inferior angle you can see it very clearly. That divides the occipital lobe from the rest of the brain. So these lobes are not really, they're quite precise areas of the brain. We can understand that where they exist. So we have the front of the parietal, temporal, occipital, and the cerebellum. They're very good divisions in them through these sulci, or through the various sulcus of the brain. Now we come to the individual parts of each one of these lobes. So the frontal lobe is divided into a superior frontal gyrus, a middle frontal gyrus, and an inferior frontal gyrus. That means it has three main bodies of, you might say, ridges that extend from the top well, extend posterior to anterior, and that's the superior, the middle, and the inferior. Likewise, the temporal lobe is divided into a superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. So they have 3 lobes within the lobe, you might say. The parietal lobe is also divided, but we're just going to talk about the parts associated with the inferior parietal gyrus in this lecture. And the occipital lobes and the cerebellum, we're not going to get into the internal areas of those. So let's start from the beginning. Let's get an idea of the arrangement of the brain within these various lobes. So as I mentioned before, we had the central sulcus that runs through the middle of the brain, dividing it front and back. Now, anterior to this sulcus, the central valley of the brain, we have what's known as the pre-central gyrus, and posterior to that we have the post-central gyrus. Now this is pretty easy to remember because pre means before and post means after. So before the central sulcus we have a gyrus, and after the central sulcus we have a gyrus. So pre is before and post is after. And if we look at it on this model, it's quite easy to see. We have the central sulcus in the middle, and we have the pre-central gyrus before or anterior to the central sulcus, and we have the post-central gyrus after or posterior to the central sulcus. Now, the pre-central gyrus is what we're going to focus on a little bit for a minute. It's also known as the primary motor cortex. Now, this is what you can see here in the red colour, the primary motor cortex. Now, this is associated with motor movements, primarily associated with motor movements. So the brain will, from the primary motor cortex or the pre-central gyrus, it will send a signal to the various muscles of your body, innervating them to contract. Now, if we take this pre-central gyrus, or what's known as the primary motor cortex, and we take a section out of it like this, and this is, if you remember, this is a coronal section of the brain, and we cut that section in half and turn it towards us. We have the left of the brain on the left and the right of the brain on the right, and we can see that the temporal lobe, where it cuts through the temporal lobe at the bottom left and the bottom right there, we can see those lobes are where they would be if we took the cut along this line. Now, if we took the area that I've got circled here on the top right, we took this area and we analysed which areas of that primary motor cortex, how they were related to the areas of the body, we'd come up with a sort of a map like this. Now, it's quite amazing that the brain isn't just a random mass of neurons. It's very well organised. And the reason for this, it's very efficient, and it's, well, I guess, and it makes it easier for us to understand. It's very well organised, and it's designed that way for a reason. Now, we have here, if we look at, okay, I'll just go back to this other picture. Now remember, we're looking at the right-hand side of the brain, and we're looking at the coronal section of the primary motor cortex, or the pre-central gyrus. Now you can see that the left, within that blue circle, the left area is the center of the brain. And as you follow the brain, or that figure, follow it around to the right, you're going to move laterally to the brain, so away from the midline of the brain. So if we start here at the toes are at, near the midline of the brain. We're looking at the right hemisphere of the brain, a coronal section of the right hemisphere. And you can see each one of the parts of our body are organised into these little areas of the brain, and this is what's known as the motor homunculus. Now, homunculus, it refers to a little man, and that's because if we were to draw out the areas of the body, it would follow the way that this is organised, that the primary motor cortex is organised, it would, in fact, represent a little man. So as you can see, if we can imagine a man standing on the ground with his hands raised over his heads, and just for demonstration of this idea, imagine that his face is upside down. So, if we have a little man standing with his arms raised up over his head, we start from the midline of the body, we start with the toes. From the toes we move up to the ankles, then from the ankles up through the legs to the knees, and through the legs up to the hips, then we have the trunk, the shoulders. So that's moving from the toes all the way up to the shoulders, ascending up the body. Then we have the elbows, the wrists, the hands, the fingers, and the thumbs. So this is a little man standing with his arms over his head. Now once you've gone through the limbs and the trunk of the body, we can go back to the head. Remember I said the face was upside down, so we start with the neck, and as we continue moving laterally, we have the eyebrows, the eyelids, the eyeballs, then the face, the lips, the jaw, and the tongue, and then a few other areas for swallowing and chewing. So this is the motor homunculus. It's because that the brain, inside the brain itself, the neurons are laid out in such a manner that they form a picture of the body, representing the areas of the body. It's amazing. The brain is laid out as an image in in an arrangement that images the arrangement of the body. Very amazing. So this motor homunculus, it's anterior to the central sulcus. As we said before, it's within the pre-central gyrus. It's involved with motor control. So when the body wants to move, it'll send a signal from the motor homunculus. Say if I want to move my hand, it'll send a signal from the hand area in the motor homunculus. There'll be cell bodies in there which get innervated and stimulated, and they'll send an electrical signal down through a series of neurons, through the brain, through the spinal cord, and out the limb, and finally to the hands and fingers. So the motor homunculus is for motor control, and it's contralateral to the body. So if the right hand, all this is in the right hemisphere of the body, this will all control the left side of the body. So here we've got the toes, that's the right hemisphere, but it will control the toes on the left side of the body. And finally, the size of the area is proportional to the extent of neural innervation, not proportional to the physical size of that body part. So let's look here for a second at the fingers. Now the fingers in this illustration, they have the largest area. So in light blue there, it's the largest area of brain tissue in this figure, amongst the rest of the areas. So the fingers have the largest amount of area devoted to them, and that's because they have the greater number of cell bodies within that area. Now you think of your fingers, they're a very small part of your body, and for example you look over here maybe at your knees and your hips, your ankles, your knees and your hips, and even your trunk together probably make up an area within the brain that is similar in size to the area within the brain that's devoted to the fingers for motor control. And that's because the fingers need to make very, very precise and fine, accurate movements in order to do things like handwriting, or using your touchscreen smartphone, or various things, playing instruments, musical instruments and things. They need to make very precise and fine movements, and to do that they need a large number of cell neurons to stimulate and coordinate together a large number of muscles. So if you want to say walk, for instance, your body it doesn't have a lot of muscles it has to think about to move. Maybe just your quadriceps, your gastrocnemius, or in other words your calf muscle, maybe your glutes to some extent, and some muscles in your feet. But when you think about your fingers, if you want to write one letter, you pretty much got to involve all your fingers, or at least two fingers and a thumb to write. You have to the shape of your fingers defines the amount of pressure, the direction of the writing. There's a lot involved in writing, and it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of movement, a lot of precise movements, and a lot of muscles working together to form that in a very precise manner. So it needs a lot of innovation, and therefore a lot of your brain is devoted to the areas of your body which require a large amount of innovation. So you notice that the tongue also has quite a large area associated with it. And that's because your tongue has to make, again, a lot of fine, precise movements at in a very quick succession. Your face also has a lot of muscles associated with it in order to give facial expressions in that. Now, so we're just going to recap. We've got the central sulcus, we've got the pre-central gyrus, and we've got the post-central gyrus. Now let's look at the sensory homunculus. This is located in the post-central gyrus. So we've done the pre-central gyrus with the motor homunculus. Now we're doing the post-central gyrus with the sensory homunculus, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to take a section, a coronal section, through the line of that post-central gyrus. We're going to turn it to face us, and we're going to be looking at the left-hand side of the brain on the left and the right-hand side of the brain on the right, and we're going to be looking forward. From a posterior view, we're going to be looking forward into the brain. Now again, we're going to take that same right-hand side, but this time it's not in the motor area, it's not in the primary motor cortex, it's in the sensory cortex, or in the post-central gyrus. So we're going to take that same area that we did before, but in the further back, posterior to the central sulcus. And interestingly enough, again, the cell bodies are arranged in such a manner that they represent the layout of the human body within that section of the brain. So we start from the bottom, or not exactly, there's a little bit of divergence. We start with the genitals, and we have toes, then the feet, then the leg, and the hips, and going lateral now, we have the trunk, the neck, the head. So we've gone from the toes all the way up to the head. Now it's a little bit different than the motor homunculus. Then we come down and we go with the arms are dropped this time. They're not extended over the head, they're dropped below the head. We have the shoulder, the arm, the elbow, the forearm, the wrist, the hand, and then the fingers and the thumbs. Now after we've done the trunk and the limbs, continuing laterally through the brain, we have the eye, the nose, the face, and then the things to do with the mouth, the teeth, the gums, jaw, and the tongue. Again, it is posterior to the central sulcus. So the motor homunculus is anterior, the sensory homunculus is posterior to the central sulcus. And it's for sensory awareness. Again, like the motor homunculus, it's contralateral to the parts of the body, so that what we're looking at here, the right-hand side of the brain, it receives sensory information from the left-hand side of the body. And again, exactly the same thing as the motor homunculus. The size of the area within the brain is proportional to the extent of neural innervation. It's not proportional to the physical size of the body part. And we can see that again with the fingers. You can see it's almost the big gyrus devoted to the fingers, as opposed to the small gyrus devoted to the leg and the hip. And that's like if you think about saying putting a thorn. You get a thorn, and maybe you're stabbed into your thigh, maybe half a centimetre. It'll penetrate into your thigh. It's going to make you jump. It will hurt, yeah, because there are sensory neurons that extend into your thigh, so you're going to feel it. However, if you can imagine that same thorn being plunged half a centimetre into your finger, now that's going to go, maybe it will go to the top of your finger, maybe halfway through to the bone. That you're not only going to jump, you're going to yell if that happens. So that's because there are a large number of sensory neurons or sensory cell bodies within that fingertip, and they are very compact. That the number of sensory cells is very compact, and so it's a very compact distribution. So there's a lot of them in a small area, and then when they extend up to the brain, that large number of sensory cells is going to manifest itself in a large area of the brain. It's going to take up a large area of the brain for processing and analysis, whereas the leg has considerably less sensory neurons. They're spaced wider apart. The sensory organs of not cell bodies, but the sensory organs of the sensory neurons are spaced further apart in the thigh, so you're going to be a overall smaller number of sensory neurons that take up a smaller area within the brain. Right, so now we've just we've gone through the central sulcus. We've had the pre-central gyrus, that was the primary motor cortex, and we had the post-central gyrus, that's for sensory information. Both of them have a layout of the human body mapped out within them, that's referred to as a homunculus, that represents the different areas of the body. Very well organised. Now we're going to go forward or anterior to the pre-central gyrus, and this is what's known as the premotor cortex. It's also known as a planning area. Now this is an area of the brain where the different muscle movements, in order to execute an action, the different muscle movements are coordinated within this area and sent to the primary motor cortex. So, for example, we have an area in the middle frontal lobule or middle frontal gyrus that's known as Exner's area. Now, this is dedicated to planning motor movements for your fingers, for example, for handwriting. So if you want to write a word, you don't have to think about, I'm going to move my thumb and forefinger in this direction, and then I'm going to move them in this direction. You do when you're a little child, when you're learning how to write, but eventually that pattern of movements gets built into your brain and it's remembered. And Exner's area is the area where it'll take that coordinated series of movements and send that whole package, that whole pattern, to the various areas of the motor cortex. So it'll say, okay, I want to write the word owl. Exner's area has done it so many times, it knows exactly which muscles you need to move, and it will send those instructions as a package to the motor cortex. The frontal eye fields is slightly inferior to Exner's area, or it depends on the textbook you read. I should reiterate that the areas of the brain, there's no definite or definitive line that you can draw where it's the same on every person. There's a huge amount of variability within the human population, and even within a person, you can have variation between the right and the left hemispheres and so forth. So this is very general, these areas, but in general, the frontal eye fields come next, and then, the frontal eye fields, obviously, they plan motor movements in particular for reading, but very fast motor movements for the eyes. So if you're reading, you have to read left to right. If you're come from a Western-oriented language, you have to read from left to right and from top to bottom. And your eyes have to make a lot of specialized movements, a lot of precise movements, read from word to word, and different, very quickly and in a very coordinated manner. Your eyes can't be going left while you're trying to read right. It's very particular, and so this movement is planned and arranged in the frontal eye fields and sent again as a pattern to the motor cortex. And finally, below the frontal eye fields, or inferior to the frontal eye fields, we have Broca's area, and this is to do with articulation or vocalization. So if you want to say something, like we talked about before, the tongue has to make a lot of very fine and precise movements, as do your lips and your pharynx. So all the muscles that are used in vocalizing a word, they are planned and coordinated within the Broca's area and then sent to the motor cortex. Now, interestingly enough, for efficiency's sake, you don't want to be sending instructions from one part of the brain right around to the other side of the brain if you don't have to. So these areas, they line up generally with the areas on the motor cortex that contain those same neurons that they need to innervate. So Exner's area will send the planned motor movements to the area on the primary motor cortex that is to do with the eyes, and that is fairly close or fairly adjacent to where Exner's area is, and the same with the frontal eye fields. And finally, if you remember on our homunculus, the premotor cortex homunculus, the face and the lips and the tongue and all that came quite near the end, or to the lateral side of the brain, and that's where Broca's area is situated, adjacent to the part of the motor cortex that controls the lips and the tongue and the pharynx. So Exner's area, here's another diagram just to point it out. Exner's area, it's in the middle frontal gyrus. It looks like it's superior frontal gyrus, but it's not. I can show you. There's the superior is right up the top. This is the middle frontal gyrus. It's anterior, as we said, to the pre-central gyrus. and it's for motor planning for handwriting. And if you have an injury in Exner's area, you're going to have deficits in handwriting. Not that you can't move your hands, but to have the coordinated pattern of movements that is required to write a word, there's going to be a deficit there. Okay, so the frontal eye fields, as we said, are in the middle frontal gyrus again, maybe inferior to the Exner's area. They're anterior to the pre-central gyrus also, and it's for motor planning for eye movements, and an injury within the frontal eye fields will result in ocular motor deficits. In other words, you have problems with moving your eyes in a coordinated manner. You'll still be able to move your eyes, but you won't be able to do it in a coordinated manner, and which will severely impact your reading ability and writing ability too, actually. And finally, we have the Broca's area, which we talked about. It's in the inferior frontal gyrus. It's anterior to the pre-central gyrus, and it's for motor planning. This function is motor planning for speech, and an injury will cause what's known as motor aphasia. So you can still make sounds, but in order to, you're going to have trouble articulating the complex pattern of motor control that's required to articulate a word. So instead of having a huge vocabulary, you're going to have a very limited vocabulary and very simple, condensed down to very simple sounds. This is demonstrated that there was a patient with a lesion in his Broca's area, and all he could say was tan. He was known as tan, I think, in the literature, because he just said tan, 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 because he didn't have the planning area, the coordination in the planning area to bring about that very complex movement that is required to form a word. Finally, okay, so we've done the premotor cortex. Finally, within the frontal lobe, there is an area here called the prefrontal cortex, or some people might refer to it as the frontal association cortex, but we'll just call it the prefrontal cortex. And we don't know too much about this, but there is one man in history that you might have heard of that gave science a head start on what the prefrontal cortex does. His name was Phineas Gage. A long time ago, he was working for a railway. He was a supervisor for a team working on the railway, and they were blasting through a mountain or around a mountain, getting a flat path for the railway lines. And the way they did this was they excavated a hole, they laid explosives in the hole, they placed sand on top of the explosives, and then they compacted that sand, or they tamped it with a tamping rod, what's known as a tamping rod. That's what he's holding in his left hand here. It's an iron bar, maybe a meter long. And that compacts the sand and the dynamite. Now, he was running the gang, and when he was doing so, he was chosen for that job. He was a very astute gentleman. He was very earnest in his job. He was an honest man, and he was very good at decision making and management and social engagement. And so he was a good supervisor. Obviously, he didn't just run the boys. He also did a bit of work himself. And then one day he was laying explosives and placing the sand and tamping the sand with a tamping rod, and he got distracted, and he went to see it. He went to address the distraction, whatever, depends on who you listen to. Some people say it was a couple of other boys fighting, some people say it was a cart tipped over. In any case, he got distracted, and when he came back, either he forgot or he didn't tell someone, or in any case, the sand that was supposed to be placed over the dynamite was not placed over the dynamite, and so he went to tamp it, and he ended up creating a spark with the iron rod on the rock, and that ignited the dynamite, or the explosives, and that explosion sent that tamping rod out of the hole and up through his skull. It entered through his left cheek, below his left eye there, and it exited out the front, the superior anterior portion of his skull. So if you understand the layout of the human brain, you'll know that at the front of the brain we have the prefrontal cortex, what we've been talking about. This is anterior to the premotor cortex that we said before, so it didn't affect his ability to make movements that we know of. Maybe they were undiagnosed, but in any case, he was able to walk that day, and he was able to articulate with the doctor what happened. So it didn't affect the movement part of his brain. However, it did affect what's known as the seat of judgment. This is the prefrontal cortex. This is the very anterior portion of the frontal lobe. When you have an injury here, it causes a deficiency in self-control and decision-making, and you might as well just make it simple and just say it made him have bad judgment. He ended up started using profanity a lot. He swore a lot. He was hard to get along with. He became an alcoholic. Well, I don't know if he was an alcoholic, but definitely started drinking. And he was a bad manager after that. And then, in fact, he lost his job. I believe he still worked until his death. He died of an associated cause. I can't remember what it was, but might have been infection or something. I can't remember. But it was a few years later anyway. But the remarkable thing was that his skills weren't affected, but his personality and his attitude was. And that's how we know that the prefrontal cortex, or the very anterior portion of the brain, has something to do with our judgment and our ability to make good judgment and to exercise self-control. So now we've done the frontal lobe. We've finished the frontal lobe, done the prefrontal cortex. Now we're going to go into the temporal lobe. And to start with, we have here the primary auditory cortex. Now this is an area of the brain. It's not actually on the lateral side of the brain as it's shown here, because you need a 3D video to show exactly where the primary auditory cortex is, but it actually extends into the lateral fissure. Remember that valley that runs up horizontally up the brain, dividing the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe? This black line here. The primary auditory cortex is located along the ridge, along the gyri, located within the lateral fissure. Now the primary auditory cortex is in the superior temporal lobule, or the superior temporal gyrus, and it's inside the lateral fissure, and it's it receives information information about the sound in your environment. So I'll have here is tonotopic sensory awareness. Now, if you imagine your your inner ear, how you hear sounds, within your inner ear, it's laid out like a piano that's rolled up into a scroll. So you have the low frequencies at one part of the portion of the spiral, and as you continue through the spiral, your frequencies get higher in ascending manner until you reach the highest frequencies that you can hear right at the other end of the spiral. So this is a tonotopic arrangement. It's arranged according to tone. And the same as with the primary auditory cortex, is the way it is arranged in your brain. You know how like the motor cortex it was arranged in the form of the human body, and the same with the sensory cortex. While the auditory cortex is arranged according to tone. So you have the low frequencies at one end and the high frequencies at the other. And this is for sensory awareness. It's not for sensory, auditory interpretation. So you can hear a word. It's like hearing a word in a foreign language. You can hear the sound, but you can't understand the word. So that's what your primary auditory cortex does. It hears and makes you consciously aware of the sounds around you, but it has nothing to do with the interpretation of those sounds. So that's primary auditory cortex. Now we come to what's known as Wernicke's area. Now this is to do with the interpretation of the sound. It's known as the secondary auditory cortex, and it is, again, it's in the superior temporal lobe or temporal gyrus, and it's posterior to the primary auditory cortex. Now this, as I said, is to do with the interpretation of the sound. So the primary auditory cortex recognizes a sound according to its tone, its pitch, its timbre, and the secondary auditory cortex interprets that sound. So you heard the sound, the word, Now the primary auditory cortex sends that information to the secondary auditory cortex, and the secondary auditory cortex, otherwise known as Wernicke's area, deciphers and processes the interpretation of that sound. Now if you have an injury in Wernicke's area, it's going to be different to an injury in the primary auditory cortex. If you have an injury in the primary auditory cortex, you're not going to be able to have an awareness of sound. The frequencies that the sound come through, they're going to be received within in the ear, but they're not going to be passed onto your brain, and so you're not going to have any awareness of sound at all. However, when you have Wernicke's area, a damage in Wernicke's area, you are going to have an awareness of the sound, but you're not going to be able to interpret it. So that's known as sensory aphasia. That's because someone can speak to you, but you have a problem with language, you have a problem interpreting it. You can hear it, but you cannot understand it. It's like everyone around you will be speaking a foreign language. So that's Wernicke's area. Now we have another little area. It's within the inferior parietal gyrus this time, and it's called the supramarginal area. These sorts of areas, this is again, we're coming to the idea that it's very generalized and there's a huge amount of variation within individuals, but the literature will generally say it's involved in reading. And near to the supramarginal area, we have another area, and it's called the angular gyrus. And this is, again, it's an inferior parietal lobule, and it's to do with writing. So together the supramarginal and the angular gyrus make up the awareness and the understanding that we need to interpret writing, whether it's through reading or whether it's through writing. And obviously they have a lot of overlap with Wernicke's area in interpretation of audible speech. There's just huge overlaps in all areas within the brain, but very generally and very on a very basic level, we're saying that the supramarginal is to do with reading and the angular is to do with writing. So that's all the areas of the brain that we're going to cover today, but there are a few more things that we need to go through. Now, one of these is the Arcuate Fasciculus. Now, this Arcuate Fasciculus is a connection, if you like, a connection cable that extends from Wernicke's area to Broca's area. This is because when you're involved in communication, audible communication, someone is speaking to you, you have to interpret that sound, and so you need Wernicke's area for that. And then when you give an answer, you have to give an answer corresponding to that which you heard. So Broca's area is for giving the answer, but Wernicke's area is for interpreting the sound that you received and deciding what you need to say. So this Arcuate Fasciculus, it connects Wernicke's and Broca's area. Now if you have an injury here, it's what's known as connection aphasia. So if this Arcuate Fasciculus is damaged in any way, you'll still be able to hear sounds, you'll still be able to interpret sounds, but the problem is, problems will come when you're trying to respond to verbal communication. So someone will ask you something, and you'll say something in response that will be, it could be totally out of context with what the question was asked of you. So it's going to give you a very mismatched way of communication. It's going to severely inhibit your ability to communicate with others, because you'll be able to understand what they're saying, and you'll be able to articulate words well, but you won't be able to necessarily respond in a manner that corresponds to what they asked you, because the sensory side, the interpretation side of what they said, is disconnected from the motor side, or the vocalization side of what you want to say. So there's going to be a disconnect there, and that's why it's called connection aphasia. Now there are other fasciculi that are not named, or not in this lecture anyway, that I'm just going to touch on. We have a couple here. They connect the supramarginal and the angular gyrus with Exner's area and the frontal eye fields. That's because, if you remember, supramarginal and angular gyrus are to do with reading and writing, And what do you need for reading and writing? You need hands and you need eyes. So Exner's area, remember, was for motor planning for handwriting, and the frontal eye fields were for motor planning for eye movement, specifically with reading. So the supramarginal and angular gyrus are connected in that manner. Now we have another one here that connects the supramarginal and angular gyrus with Wernicke's area. That's because if you receive verbal communication like a question and you are to respond in a written form, you need a connection between the sensory side of things, the Wernicke's area, the audible interpretation or the semantic understanding of what is asked you, and you need a connection with that, and instead of Broca's area, like we had before, you have a connection with the handwriting portion of the brain, which goes through the supramarginal and angular gyrus through to the frontal eye fields and the Exner's area. So that we have three sort of connections. We have what we looked at before. We have the Arcuate Fasciculus, which connects the Wernicke's area with Broca's area. So that's because you need a connection between what is asked of you and how you verbally respond. You also need a connection between Wernicke's area and the supramarginal and angular gyrus and the frontal eye fields and Exner's area, so you can respond in a written form to something that is verbally asked of you. So the aphasias that result, we've talked about one aphasia, that was with when you have damage to Broca's area, and that results in, remember we said there's a person who could only just say tan, 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 because he had all the motor control, but he didn't have the planning area of the brain that is necessary to coordinate all the muscle movements to say complex words. So all he could say was tan. So that's known as motor aphasia, when Broca's area is affected. You have sensory aphasia when Wernicke's area is damaged or injured. That's so you can hear audibly, you can hear people saying things to you, but you can't interpret what they're saying. And finally, we had a connection aphasia. That's when you can hear what people are saying, you can understand what they're saying, you can vocalize different words, even complex words, but there's a disconnect between what is spoken to you, the verbal, the sensory information that's coming into you, and what you want to reply with. So in recent current news, we had Bruce Willis has informed his fans and the public in general that he is stepping away from acting, and this is because he's been diagnosed with a condition known as aphasia. Now, they didn't tell us what type of aphasia Bruce Willis has. They just said aphasia. Now, it could be any of the three that we mentioned, or it could be others. Now, how would you tell, if you could run a test on Bruce Willis, to see what area of the brain was affected? What test would you run in order to discern what type of aphasia Bruce Willis has? Well, to determine if he had a problem with, say, the Broca's region, well, you just have to ask yourself, can he articulate words? And if he could say words, just any words, t-shirt, motorboat, hand towel, if he could say anything like that, then you know it's not a problem with Broca's area, because he still has that cognitive ability to plan and coordinate the muscles required for spoken language. However, if he had sensory aphasia, how would you discern if he had sensory aphasia? Well, you could ask him if he understood something that you said. So you could say to him, "Hey Bruce, today is Thursday, do you understand?" And he could nod his head, or he could shake his head if he didn't. But then if he didn't, then I suppose he really did. So if he understands your communication to him, then he probably doesn't have sensory aphasia. But how would you discern if he had a connection aphasia? Well, he would have to have a motor ability. He would have to have a sensory ability. But there would have to be a disconnect between the two. So a way you could do this was say, hey Bruce, can you write down what day it is today? And if he could write on a piece of paper that today is Thursday, that means he had a sensory awareness. So it's definitely not pharynx area that's damaged. And if you could say, hey Bruce, can you say Thursday for me? If you could say any word, it doesn't matter if it was, if you said Monday or if he said wharf or seagull, if he could say anything, that would mean he didn't have motor aphasia. But if it didn't relate to the question, you could say he had a connection aphasia, and that would be a problem with the Arcuate Fasciculus. So what condition Bruce Willis has? Well, only time will tell. We don't know yet. The most commonly affected area when you have a stroke, I'm not saying Bruce Willis has had a stroke, but the most commonly affected area is Broca's area. So if he has a deficit in speaking and in articulating words, then probably he has a motor aphasia or a problem with Broca's area. If he's just making word salad of his speech when someone asks him a question and just saying duck, dog, and handbook, fly, aeroplane, well, probably he has a connection aphasia. Or if he doesn't understand anything that you said, then he probably has a sensory aphasia. So that's the nervous system, Lecture 1, Introduction to the Brain. We'll leave it there and see you on Lecture 2.